I think you have to sit down for you to be,
You gotta sit down, so
So did you print something?
I couldn't,
Didn't work.
all right, didn't work.
Not connecting?
I could try it again.
Well, here, hold on, let me see.
it's a live stream.
You have to tap there and then go down, that's it. Click on that, yeah.
And it's 1, 2, 15.
4 to 15. Yes, hello, how are you? Good evening, so we're doing a talk on Henry George tonight. We are doing book number 8, which is about best advantage of land, of using land, okay? So to start out here, we have a picture of Henry George. This is a younger photo of him, where he's got all that hair around his ears. And then we also have the book. This is the original printing, but it was printed in 1879. This is 1881 edition, and we have book 8, and it's in 4 chapters here. Private property and land inconsistent with the best use of land. How equal rights to the land may be asserted and secured. The proposition tied by the canons of taxation, and endorsements and objectives. Okay, so we can start out with a poem. Anybody want to read a poem tonight?
Yeah, I'll read it.
All right, Marty, let's hear it.
So it's from E.R. Taylor. Why hesitate? Ye are full-bearded men with God-implanted will, and courage if ye dare but show it. Never yet was will, but found some way or means to work it out. Nor e'er did fortune frown on him who dared. Shall we, in presence of his grievous wrong, in the supremest moment of all time, stand trembling, cowering, when with one bold stroke these groaning millions might be ever free, and that one stroke so just, so greatly good, so level with the happiness of man, that all the angels will applaud the deed.
So this is from E.R. Taylor. He was a contemporary of Henry George, an English artist, educator. His poem can allude to ending monopoly on land as the one simple cure to the outgrowth of many social, economic, political injustices associated with it. So George's best-selling work, Progress and Poverty, in the writing style of his era, defines the nature of the issue, its causes, results, and effect upon the subsequent situation of political economy. Okay, so next slide. So the first chapter, private property and land inconsistent with the best use of land. So a delusion persists. So there is a delusion resulting from the tendency to confound the accidental with the essential. It's a delusion which the law writers have done their best to extend, and political economists generally have acquiesced in, rather than endeavor to expose that private property and land is necessary to the proper use of land, and that again, to make land common, property would be to destroy civilization and revert to barbarism. Now, I wonder who says that. Probably landowners, right? Those would be the ones. So George immediately identifies where he feels that this is a long-held delusion, that private property and land is necessary to the proper use of land. And we'll give separate examples where it's not necessarily the case. Many countries always lease land, but then again, people build on top of it, and they have a certain time period to take advantage. It's like that in many places, but not as much here. Okay, so this is another big theme of Henry George: security for improvements versus absolute ownership. In other words, this is a way to lease land, and then also, if you don't own it, but you're building on it and you're using it, and you're getting your security for the improvement. That's the important point there. So that's what that is about. Okay, so it says here, The delusion may be likened to the idea which, according to Charles Lamb, so long prevailed about the Chinese after the savor of roast pork had been accidentally discovered by the burning of Ho Ti's hut. So this is a pork story. That to cook a pig, it was necessary to set a fire to a house. But though in Lamb's charming dissertation it was required that a sage should arrive to teach people that they might roast pigs without burning down houses, it does not take a sage to see that what is required for the improvement of land is not absolute ownership of the land, but security of the improvements. So if you're entitled to security of improvements, then you will be getting the production that comes with the land, whether you own it or not, which is how it used to be in feudal times as well. Okay, so here we are. My place or yours for the pig roast tonight. Check your insurance policy to see if it's covered for pig roast. If it is, then, you know, I just did I did rehab my kitchen with hickory. I'll bet it will taste really good. So anyways, so there is no more necessity for a man to making a man the absolute and exclusive owner of the land in order to introduce him to improve it. But there is a burning down of a house, then there is a burning down the house in order to cook a pig. While making of the land private property is as rude and wasteful and uncertain a device for securing improvement as the burning down of a house is rude, wasteful, and uncertain device for roasting pig. We have not the excuse for persisting in the one of Lamb's Chinese villagers had and persisting in the other. And of course, you know, this is a metaphor of the story about the pig. It's quite, you know, it's a real stretch of the imagination, but sometimes they're used for metaphors. And it's basically about equity versus efficiency, and it's mentioned as absolute ownership earlier versus security for improvements. So it's a common matter for use to be separated from ownership. But among us, nothing is more common than land to be improved by those who do not own it. The greater part of land in Great Britain is cultivated by tenants, and the greater part of buildings of London are built upon leased ground. And even in the United States, the same system prevails everywhere to a lesser or greater extent. Thus, it is common matter for use to be separated from ownership. In this way it's done. Okay. So whatever your labor or capital produces on this land shall be yours. What is necessary for the use of land is not its private ownership, but security of improvements. So if you know that what you do on this land will be yours, you have no qualms whatsoever of building on it. So, and these are the natural rewards of labor. So this all follows naturally. Okay, relationship of efficiency and equity in the usage of land is noted. Now, the mere pledge of an Irish landlord years ago that for 20 years he would not claim and rent any share of their cultivation induced Irish peasants to turn a barren mountain into gardens on the mere security of a fixed ground rent for a term of years. The most costly buildings of such cities as London and New York are erected on leased grounds. If we give improvers such security, we may safely abolish private property and land. So this is a very important concept. And like I said, if you're getting this, if you have the security that any improvements on the land, that money made from that will be yours, then it's a workable system. Okay. So what was once regarded as customary and allowable shape-shifted into a legal matter over time. Now, during feudal times, there were commons, and the peasants could use them, and there was different rules for different parts of the land. If someone left it, some of the harvest uncollected at a certain time, during a certain time window, peasants and the indigent were allowed to harvest it and use that. And there were certain, this was in certain cases. So what happened over time during agrarian capitalism, the customary became challenged by the legal. so that they got rid of what was generally thought as customary. And they were able to take all this common land and shared land and turn it into private land. And that's what happened mainly in the agrarian revolution. Okay, so now nothing would change if everything would go on as now, and yet the common right to land would be fully recognized by appropriating rent to the common benefit. Now this, of course, is the way to basically land value tax, where you will capture the extra value on the land as tax, and you use that for the benefit of the common good. And this still does not have great acceptance, but it did have a lot of acceptance among a lot of economists after Ricardo's law of rent was introduced, because it made a lot of sense then. And there's a very simple model with Ricardo's law of rent as well. Okay. So another great example of what is working. What are we waiting for here? So there's a lot in the center of San Francisco to which the common rights of the people of the city are legally recognized. This lot is not cut up into infinitesimal pieces, nor yet is it an unused waste. It is covered with fine buildings, the property of private individuals that stand there in perfect security. The only difference between this lot and those around it is that the rent of one goes into the common school fund. The rent of the other goes into private pockets. What is to prevent the land of the whole country being held by the people of the country in this way? So you see, side by side in San Francisco, you have these buildings, and one of them is a school where any money made, you know, if they rent the school out for using for other things or what it's done for, any money made, it goes back into the common fund for the school. And this is the same concept, whereas if you have a land value tax, and it's the same thing as the owner of the land paying rent to the state, and the state holds the money for the fund, for the common fund. That's how that would work. So there's another excellent case study here of efficient use of benefiting the state of Alaska. Something, of course, Alaska was once known as Seward's Folly. It was paid for like 2 cents to an acre. It was $7 million. And of course, everybody thought it was, they joked about it first that it was an icebox. But this is a great example of the value of land. Like by the late 1890s, they discovered gold, and everybody was, you know, the Klondike gold rush. Everybody was headed to Alaska. There was gold there. Alaska is like extremely wealthy. It's 1/5 of the total land mass of the 48 states. It's huge. And just in the state of Alaska, oil, gold, minerals, so many riches there. And what happens, I'll read it to you now, but it's not necessary, therefore, to make these islands private property. These were some islands where they had seals on, and through reasons greatly less cogent, the great public domain of the American people has been made over to private ownership as fast as anybody could be got to take it. These islands, on the other hand, were leased at a rent of $317,500 a year, probably not very much less than you could have been sold for at the time of the Alaska purchase. They have already yielded $2.5 million to the national treasury, and they are still an unimpaired value, for under the careful management of the Alaska Fur Company, the seals increase rather than diminish the common property of the people of the United States. Now these were some islands where they have these seals, and they harvest the seals every year, and they're allowed to take the fixed rent upon the lease of the Alaska Fur Company is $55,000 a year, with a payment of $2.62 for each skin. So with 100,000 skins, which they call from the seals, these seals come to mate on these islands. These seals, they haven't heard of the latest news yet about the people that can come there and hunt them and destroy them. So they're really I mean, if this were run as a private business and someone bought the land and it were private and they had a shareholder value on it and they wanted to get as much money as possible, they'd probably kill off all the seals and you wouldn't have the seals there every year. You wouldn't get your 100,000 seal pelts. But still, every year, it's a renewable resource. And this is one of the greatest examples of a profitable LVT, land value, or LVC, land value capture. And then, as I said here, so and a little more background on this, on Alaska. The Tsars, the government of Russia, which established a presence in Alaska in the mid-18th century, first approached the United States about selling the territory during the administration of President James Buchanan. But negotiations were stalled because of the outbreak of the Civil War. By 1865, Seward, a supporter of territorial expansion, was eager to acquire this tremendous landmass of Alaska, an area roughly, as I mentioned before, 1/5 the size of the United States. He had some difficulty, however, making the case for the purchase of Alaska before the Senate, which ratified the treaty by a margin of just one vote on April the 9th, 1867. 6 months later, Alaska was formally handed over from Russia to the U.S., despite a slow start. And then discovery of gold, 1898, brought a rapid influx of people there. So that's a great example of a really good model of land value capture. So treating land as private property impedes improvement contrary to popular belief. Now, so far, the recognition of private property and land being necessary. So, by the way, if anybody else wants to read, I certainly wouldn't mind that. Want to try it, Diane? No, you don't review it. Okay. So, I'll keep reading. So, treating land as private property stands in the way of its private use. Were land treated as public property, it would not be used or improved as soon as there was. It would be used and improved as soon as there was a need for its use or improvement. But being treated as private property, the individual owner is permitted to prevent others from using or improving what he cannot or will not use for himself or others. Now you see this in lots in Manhattan, all those parking lots that they built buildings on, they sat there for years, they just made money. You know, even a car was up to $40 now for a car to park something like 6 to 8 hours. Not a bad business, you know. But at any point, is these lots sit there, they get passed on down to the family, they're tax write-offs, because the tax value of the land is next to nothing, because it's just a bunch of weeds and it's tarmac. That's it. So they keep the value low, and they have it basically in abeyance for 15, 20 years. Finally, the location has caught up with the plot of land, and it's a great location, and it's time to build. Happens all the time. That's what happened in Chelsea. Chelsea used to be loaded with parking lots, and they all turned into big condos, luxury condos.
I'll read something if you want.
So go ahead, Marty, here.
This is in consideration of land's best use. The private and public paradigm needs to be revisited. In every city, valuable lots may be seen lying vacant. If the best use of land be the test, then private property and land is condemned, as it is condemned by every other consideration. It is as wasteful and uncertain a mode of securing the proper use of land as burning down of houses is of roasting pigs.
See, back to our pork analogy.
Yeah.
So George chooses just two brilliant examples here that would support his argument. And then he also gives us another roast pig story. So here we're on to chapter 2. How equal rights to the land may be asserted and secured. So upon what does the paradox of our times, the increase of want and the increase of wealth, continue to exist? This is a big question. This is from George's Progress and Poverty. You know, why in the midst of plenty is there still a want for more, you know? And so it's an enigma, really, because no one can solve it. In fact, it's gotten worse. The inequality has grown more. It's increasing. Even I did a talk last week on Germany, 2 weeks ago. And even in Germany, for all their social democracy and everything, they still have inequality there. 60% of the wealth is in 10% of the hands. 20%, excuse me. Not quite as bad as here, but still, it's a similar problem. Seems to be hardwired with capitalism. So we have traced the want and suffering that everywhere prevail among the working classes, the recurring paroxysms of industrial depression, the scarcity of employment, the stagnation of capital, the tendency of wages to the starvation point, the tendency of more and more strongly as material progress goes on. That tendency becomes stronger. To the fact that the land on which and from all must live is made the exclusive property of some. It's a monopoly. Land is a monopoly. And through the device of speculation, it's kept at a high price, such that it keeps driving up prices more as speculation continues. And a land bubble is created, and it keeps most of the common people, it keeps them away from land. They can't play the game. So why is this still happening? We have seen that there is no possible remedy for these evils but the abolition of their cause. We have seen that private property and land has no warrant in justice, but stands condemned as the denial of natural right, a subversion of the law of nature that, as social development goes on, must condemn the masses of men to a slavery the hardest and most degraded. So it's really not something that's available to most people. And you see that by these land lots that are kept in abeyance and never used until like 20 years later, a big building comes up. And it works great, for the person that owns that lot, because eventually the value of the area catches up to the place where the person bought the lot at a very cheap price 15, 20 years earlier. It always happens. That's the nature of land. Like, it was quite obvious, like, when I used to live out west, you would see it. You would see it over time. In other words, a gas station will always build up on a crossroads, then a convenience store, then something else, then a little strip mall. And you would see over time how the spaces between these crossroads that would meet would fill up. And that's how it always worked out west. So what's the next step? So we have weighted every object and seen that neither on the ground of equity or expediency is there anything to deter us from making land common property by confiscating rent. But a question of method remains. How shall we do it? There's the rub, How can you break a 2,000 to 3,000 year old trend in private property? That the kings and the nobles have loved. It took hundreds of years of an agrarian capitalist revolution to change the paradigm, to get the land away from the commons and shared by peasants to make it more private. And it took centuries of an incubation period for them to get them to swallow that bitter pill, which they did eventually. It took a long time. So, staying within the same model, we must focus on securing the greatest production. So if you can't beat them, join them. Because with the same thing they did with the agrarian capitalism, they did everything to improve the land to increase the production. And what happened eventually, they used the accumulation of wealth through the capture of rent. And they used to do rack rents. A rack rent was exactly what they do here in Manhattan. Every year or every 2 years, you sign a lease and you get an increase in rent, because every year they adjust and they assess that property at the value it is at that moment, so that they can raise your rent. And all kinds of things, like if you rent commercial space, you pay for common space. You're paying for the bathrooms, you're paying for the hallways, you're paying for the foyer, and it's all allotted to you by proportion of the land that you occupy in the building. And then they divide your portion up of the occupied land amongst the portion of the unoccupied land so that everyone pays for it. And then, when you give a security deposit to the landlord, every year he sends you a bill for maintaining your escrow. And it's exactly the same as the interest that you got on the escrow. So you never get the interest either. So even at this time also, Henry George, a leading Victorian thinker, Herbert Spencer, was the father of English sociology. And he agreed with George's writings and backed them up too. So he was an English philosopher, biologist, sociologist. He was the prominent classical liberal political theorist of Victorian times. Herbert Spencer was best known for originating the saying, survival of the fittest, and was considered to be the father of sociology in England. And his example here, which I'll read about, is to look at land as, he explained it as a joint stock concept, which at that time was an invention of capitalism. It's how it started in Amsterdam and then later went to London. Okay, so Herbert Spencer here, who says it from such a doctrine need cause no very serious revolution in existing arrangements. This change, the change required would simply be a change of landlords. Separate ownership would merge into the joint stock ownership of the public, whereby the public would all be considered shareholders or stakeholders in this case as well. Instead of being in the possession of individuals, the country would be held by the greatest corporate body, society. So instead of leasing his acres from an isolated proprietor, the farmer would lease them from the nation. Instead of paying his rent to the agent of Sir John or His Grace, he would spend it to an agent or deputy agent of the community. Stewards would be public officials instead of private ones. Under it, all men would be equally landlords. All men would be alike, free to become tenants. Clearly, therefore, on such a system, the earth might be enclosed, occupied and cultivated in entire subordination to the law of equal freedom. So there is a way to make it work. And this was a great Victorian thinker that backed Henry George up on, fully on this point. Okay, so the Georgist model is a good fit with the current system. Great changes are best introduced in such a manner. So great changes can best be brought about under old forms. We who would be freemen should heed the same truth. It is a natural method when nature would make a higher type. She takes a lower one and develops it. So this also is the law of social growth. Let us work with it. With the current, we may glide fast and far. Against it, it is hard pulling and slow progress. So, go with what you know, rather than try to do something completely different that you might not get no backing on. So George's proposal still includes private property. A land is not confiscated. Only rent will be affected. Let the individuals who now hold it still retain, if they want to, possession of what they are pleased to call their land. Let them continue to call it their land. Let them buy and sell and bequeath and devise it. So we may safely leave them the shell if we take the kernel being the land value capture. It is not necessary to confiscate land. It is only necessary to confiscate rent. So that's it in a nutshell for the land value capture. So Marty, I have some notes that I can access here. Let me just see them here if I can get. Can you put that in not in the full screen, but a small screen, and so I can see the notes that are underneath, because I can't get them from here. So that was it. In other words, give them the shell, let them have the land, but we'll take the kernel, which is the wealth that comes from usage of the land. Okay, so what are the benefits of this proposal, and what exactly is the proposal again? So what I therefore propose as a simple yet sovereign remedy, which will raise wages, increase the earnings of capital, extirpate pauperism, abolish poverty, give remunerative employment to whoever wishes it, afford free scope of human powers, lessen crime, elevate morals and taste and intelligence, purify government, and carry civilization to yet nobler heights. And that is to appropriate rent by taxation. Okay, so furthermore, it will involve a single tax solution, abolishing all taxes as we know them today, except for one. Now, insomuch as the taxation of rent or land values must necessarily be increased just as we abolish our other taxes, we must put the proposition into the practical form by proposing to abolish all taxation, save that upon land values. So it is a possibility that that can be done, and that's what we try to do. That's what we're working at.
Yeah,
So Marty, you able to get it then? Yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, yeah. So I can access. Which slide are we on now? Cancel. Okay, so security for improvements. See, because I can see the numbers here, and I can't see them on my. Let me use this. I can't see them on this the way we have it here. Okay, so here we are. Furthermore. Okay, so
You need to move to your left a little bit for the screenshot.
system.
Mike,
Hmm?
you need to move that. Or your body.
Right here, right, okay. So, will get me back in there. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, the single land value tax is the first step. After that, as prosperity increases, the need may arise for more. Now, generally, when, in a prosperous community, and there will be more business going on, since land will be getting more use, instead of being held, for building on it 20 years later. Okay, so as we have seen, the value of land is at the beginning of society nothing. But as society develops, by the increase of population and the advance of the arts, it becomes greater and greater. In every civilized country, even the newest, the value of land taken as a whole is sufficient to bear the entire expense of government. In the better developed countries, it is much more than sufficient. Okay, afterwards, it will not be enough to place all taxes upon the value of land. So in other words, eventually you will need to collect the other taxes as well, but first must focus. But the proposition to put all taxes on the value of land is the first step, upon which the practical struggle must be made. When the common right to land is so far appreciated that all taxes are abolished, save those which fall upon rent, there is no danger of much more than is necessary to induce them to collect the public revenues being left to the individual landholders. So you would eventually collect them from the private landholders as well. Okay. So unfortunately, confused thinking continues by design to slow acceptance, behind efforts of powerful interests unwilling to adapt. So, experience has taught me, for I have been for some years endeavoring to popularize this proposition, that whenever the idea of concentrating all taxation upon land values finds lodgment sufficient to induce consideration, it invariably makes way, but there are few of the classes most to be benefited by it, who at first, or even in the long run, long time afterwards, see its full significance and power. They can't see it. It's difficult to get the idea across that to exempt capital from taxation would be to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. These ideas spring from confused thought, but behind ignorance and prejudice, there is a powerful interest that has hitherto dominated literature, education, and opinion. A great wrong always dies hard, and the great wrong, which in every civilized country condemns the masses of men to poverty and want, will not die without a bitter struggle. So there's a huge private interest in keeping land private. So of course, there's nothing as great as misinformation to keep things private. So, in adapting the remedy, certain principles of taxation must be understood and deserve attention. Follow me further, that we may try the remedy I have proposed for the accepted canons of taxation, and in doing so, many incidental bearings may be seen that otherwise might escape notice. So this is a quite interesting chapter about taxation, what it does. So chapter 3, the proposition tried by the canons of taxation. So the best tax by which the public revenues can be raised is evidently that which will closest conform to the following conditions, so that it bears as lightly upon production, so at least to check and increase the general fund from which taxes must be paid and community maintained, that it be easily and cheaply collected and fall as directly as may be upon the ultimate payers. This is extremely important, so as to take from people as little as possible in addition to what it yields to government. So that it be certain. This is very important. You might have a great piece of property that you'll make money on, but if it's not certain, like if you'll never get paid, it doesn't help. So to be certain, so as to give the least opportunity for tyranny or corruption on the part of officials and the least temptation to law-breaking and evasion on the part of taxpayers. That it bears equally, so that as to give no citizen an advantage of put any at a disadvantage as compared with the others. Let us consider what form of taxation best accord with these conditions. Whatever it be, that evidently will be the best mode in which the public revenue can be raised. Okay, so the effect of taxes upon production. All taxes must evidently come from the produce of land and labor, since there is no other source of wealth than the union of human exertion and the material and forces of nature. But the manner in which equal amounts of taxation may be imposed may very differently affect the production of wealth. Taxation, which lessens the reward of the producer, necessarily lessens the incentive to production. Taxation, which is conditioned upon the act of production, necessarily discourages production. So you have to be careful not to tax a process of production. Whatever it is, if it's a process of production and you tax it, it affects production. Say there's loaning money. So if you tax loans, you basically, people won't take as many loans. So taxes have a great effect upon minimizing what they choose to tax. But on the contrary, with land, if you tax a laborer or you tax the land, it doesn't really bear on the land directly. And for some reason, it doesn't have the same effect. But you must always be careful not to tax a process of production. So taxation's diminishing effects upon earnings and the processes of production as opposed upon laborers, wealth, or land. Thus, taxation, which diminishes the earnings of the laborer or the returns of the capitalist tends to render the one less industrious and the other and intelligent, the other less disposed to save and invest. So taxation, which falls upon the process of production, interposes an artificial obstacle to the creation of wealth. Taxation, which falls upon labor as it is exerted, wealth as it is used as capital, and land as it is cultivated, will manifestly tend to discourage production much more powerfully than taxation to the same amount levied upon laborers, whether they work or play, upon wealth, whether using productively or unproductively, or upon land, whether cultivated or left waste. So if you have a question, you know, please interrupt, and we can field your question. There's Marty and myself here as well, okay?
I got a question, but I'll save it for the end.
What's that?
Well, it had to do with the agrarian revolution.
Oh, okay.
You want me to ask it now?
Yeah, actually, there's another slide I have there, and I can see and you know, I'll see the notes here as well on that. So the
Well, maybe I should just wait.
Yeah, well, all right. So do you want to reply to
Well,
that?
the question is, the agrarian revolution was turning feudal lands into capitalist production and enclosing. Was that the essential, what the revolution was? It wasn't a revolution where, I guess common people are dancing around and chopping off heads, but it's
Well,
more of,
You know, what happened is the plague, because after the plague, the working population was greatly diminished. So you had some of the lords fighting over workers. So they would even pay them more, give them more favors. You know, they were sitting, as they say, they were sitting in the catbird seat. You know, they were in a good place to be. So that's really what changed it. There's nothing that's so changing as death. So what happened was the changeover from feudalism to capitalism. In feudalism, you know, the surplus capture was only done through the peasant's willingness to give extra produce from the land. The peasant was attached to the land by obligation because the lord owned the land and he let the peasant live there if the peasant would farm the land and then so give some to him as well, some surplus. But the only way to capture the surplus could be by force, you know? And the only way that a lord had to get more wealth was to go out and destroy another lord and take all his peasants and land and wealth. And that was it. It was like a dead-end situation. Feudalism had to go. There was no way to do it. So a very, very slow process over time of getting the situation right, whereby the lords could make, and it happened when they made it, then they tied it to the market, to the free market. Because then land became a commodity, labor became a commodity, wages became commoditized. So basically, labor was suddenly commoditized. So, I mean, the good, smart laborers, you know, would make their money, but the people that basically had to be like pointed as to where to work, they would take a cheap wage, and they immediately gave up any claim to their production, as in feudalism you had. They immediately gave it up by taking a wage. But the landlord, of course, this was great for him, because of course the person would work and any production went right to the landlord. He just gave him a wage. But what was happening over the long run was that by tying it to the market, they managed to get the most out of land, and improvement was ongoing. And the lord of the land would accumulate wealth through rent. He would charge more for each parcel. Different parcels would take different prices. So that's what that was the trend. It changed basically from feudalism to capitalism once it became so tied to the market, the land, that they were accumulating wealth through rent. This is why there's room there for the land value capture through the rent, because the landlord would capture the wealth, and people couldn't they couldn't see the hand and glove fit here, but that's how it worked.
Yeah, so, yeah, that's good.
Thank you.
I guess there's a parallel thing about how banks work, but we're not there yet, so.
No, the bank, that has to do with the joint stock company. So the joint stock company was an invention of capitalism. And in the joint stock company, because at that same time that capitalism was happening, trade routes were opening up all over the world. And those were owned by the crown. And the crown, that was a monopoly. So the best thing, like I forget, this is a book that came out, competition is for dummies. Monopoly is what counts. Something like that. Anyways, the point is that when you have a monopoly, you're it. All the business has to come to you. Like they have this, when they privatize a jail, that's a monopoly. All these states and counties have jails. People just don't build they've got like an extra room in the back. They don't build a jail, or they don't make this extra, they don't tell the sheriff, hey, I've got an extra building in the back, I want it to be a jail. Can I house some guys there? Anyways, that's not how it's done. But it's basically a monopoly. That's a monopoly. The same thing like water systems. You have all these small town water systems. They don't have enough money in a small town to pay someone to manage the water. So they pay these management companies that do it. And these management companies will do it for 10, 20, 30, 40 small towns, and they make a good profit that way. So that's monopoly. So let's get back on the mode here. Mode of taxation is quite as important as the amount. So here, we're going to go to a horse analogy rather than a pork analogy.
Right.
So as a small burden, badly placed, may distress a horse that could carry with ease a much larger one, properly adjusted, so a people may be impoverished and their power of producing wealth destroyed by taxation, which if levied in another way could be borne with ease. A tax on date trees, for instance, imposed by Muhammad Ali. He was the self-imposed leader of Egypt. He was basically a janissary, and he took over Egypt from the Ottoman Empire when the Mamelukes took it. Mameluke, I believe, is a sort of an Arabic word. It means slave or something. And most of the Mamelukes were basically Christian slave boys from the Caucasus that were bought in youth and then raised in barracks to be civil servants. And this is how the caliphate of the Ottoman Empire never had to worry about families assuming power. So anyways, Muhammad Ali caused the Egyptian fellahs. Now fellahs, actually, that's not a homey term. That's actually an Arabic term for a rural land worker, for a peasant, a fellah. But the plural is fellahin. It's not fellas. So I think George took some liberal. He took it upon himself to just add an S to make it plural, and it sounds like fellas. You would never know. So, anyways, the Egyptian fellas cut down their trees, but a tax of twice the amount imposed on the land produced no such tax. So if you were to tax the date trees, these guys are just peasants. They say, oh no, I can never pay it, I have to cut the tree down. And they do it. So you see, that's why you don't tax the process of production, which a fruit tree is. So wealth is greatly reduced by taxation, which bears upon any processes of its production. So production of wealth in the United States is largely lessened by taxation, which bears upon its process. Shipbuilding, in which we excelled, has all been but destroyed so far as foreign trade is concerned, and many branches of production and exchange seriously crippled by taxes which divert industry much more or less to more or less productive forms. So I mean, if it favors production, they will up the production. If they tax production, you will look for a cheaper way to do it. You won't look for, in looking for a better way, you will look for a cheaper way instead of a better way. But whereas if they tax the labor, he will look for a better way, not a cheaper way. Okay, so any tax that checks production is similar in effect to chopping down a fruit-producing tree. So the checking of production is in greater or lesser degree characteristic of most of the taxes by which the revenues of modern governments are raised. All taxes upon manufacturers, all taxes upon commerce, all taxes upon capital, all taxes upon improvement are of this kind. Their tendency is the same as that of Muhammad Ali's tax on date trees, though their effect may not be so clearly seen. Okay, so production checking taxes are best avoided except in times until society accumulates wealth. All such taxes have a tendency to reduce the production of wealth and should therefore never be resorted to when it is possible to raise money by taxes which do not check production. This becomes possible as society develops and wealth accumulates. Taxes which fall upon ostentation simply turn into the public treasury what otherwise would be wasted in vanity for the sake of show. But taxes upon wills and devices of the rich will probably have little effect in checking the desire for accumulation, which after it has fairly got hold of someone becomes a blind passion. Okay, so taxing of monopolies to check production is to be embraced with a sense of mission. So again, monopolies are basically, well, they're really not they're looked forward to in capitalism, because you can, so as they say, make a killing. But they're not fair play. But you have all kinds of monopolies out there, So, but the great class of taxes from which revenue may be derived without interference with production or taxes are taxes upon monopolies. For the profit of monopoly is in itself a tax levied upon production, and to tax it is to simply divert into the public coffers what production must in any event pay for. So we're coming to the land value tax here. Like, land appropriation is a monopoly. Land in itself is basically a monopoly of sorts. You really have to have access to credit to be able to be in the land business. And, many real estate developers, many people in real estate, that's the name of the game. If you can buy off of a certain amount, hold it till you have to pay up, and then flip it over. But, there's more TV commercials about it than I think that are really happening. But that's what they try to induce you to do on these TV commercials. Okay, so variations of monopolies, temporary forms, patent and copyright laws, and the onerous forms gaining power by accumulation of large amounts of capital. Okay, so here George diverges from the talk on land and taxes and touches upon the difference between copyrights and patents. So we'll skip that. But on the nature of monopolies, he also alludes to Book 3, Chapter 4, about the railroad as getting power by accumulation and not productive increase. So this is a very important angle to view here at this, to look at this. Because, hang on. So, notes. Okay, so from Chapter 4, Book 3, I diverted into this also. So I want to explain to you the difference of power by accumulation as power by increase, okay? So the accumulation of large amounts of capital under consolidated control creates a new kind of power, essentially different from power of increase. Increase is instructive in its nature. Power from accumulation is destructive. So it is often exercised with reckless disregard, not only to industry, but to the personal rights of individuals. He was talking about the railroads here in his time. But of course, we have a far better example of this today. So what can you see? Does anybody want to take a guess at what the example is? That, by accumulation.
Talking about between railroads?
Well, it was railroads, of course. What generally happens anytime when there's a new technology, what happens is the power of accumulation, a bunch of money. Like right now, you have all these banks that are looking for the new blockchain technology. They'll get the one that everybody else will be using as the operating system. And there's money to be made in that. So you have them. They have like legions of people sitting there, typing away, trying to find this. So what I'm making allusion to, let's talk about it. Power of accumulation, right?
What?
Can you explain
Speak up, please.
Can you explain the?
Well, let me just, I'll just let it out of the box. Financialization of the economy. So, the real economy has been captured by the weight of money. This is large amounts of cash. Like even when, for instance, like the commodity market was captured. They had index funds in commodities. And it was captured by large amounts of cash. And what they did, it was by a technique. Now, the computers are relatively new discovery. So this is like what happened, same thing happened in 1987 when they had the big crash. They just kept, all these program traders came on at the same moment. And the computer just could not deal with this. It was not programmed to take such volume in such short time and such rapid. And the same thing with the commodity market. And what happened was it got a demand shock. The computer gets a demand shock. So this is what happened. So like these things were done in total disregard to everyone else. They created these huge collapses in the market. And the reason they had to fix that, because what happened is the stock that was falling down and going down, it would not appear on the screen. So the people that had done the program trading, they of course wanted it to appear on the screen so they could buy it back at a cheaper price. And then eventually it would go back to its level. But these are done in total reckless disregard for everyone else. Millions, billions of dollars are lost in these crashes.
So today it's just more complicated, but it's the same process in '87. It's just
Same foot, different shoe. It's the more it changes, the more it stays the same. So that's basically what it's derivatives. The derivative economy, which is all done over the OTC, over the counter trading. It's like 120 times what the real value is in the real economy. And these banks cannot do without these large volumes of cash circulating in the OTC market through the derivative trade. They can't do without it.
So Henry George made a point of the accumulations is bad. What's good is the increases, because you have a tendency of gradual growth that you can manage. Is that the idea?
Well, I mean, you have to, they try to make economics part of natural law. So in natural law, like rapid growth is cancerous. You can't experience this double-digit growth continually. There's a certain growth curve that is sustainable, that can be done. Like when they're harvesting the seals, they know they get 100,000 pelts from these seals on this island, but they know that they can't go beyond a certain term. It wouldn't work, or a certain value. It wouldn't work. So they have to, you have to make it. It has to go according to natural law. It really does. I mean, there's a lot of people that follow the market that use it like with the Fibonacci curves and all these other things that follow natural, and they try to. And some people have actually made money that way, and they say they have, but we don't know. So anyways, so here, as I was saying, increase by accumulation it can be destructive. Okay, so all other monopolies are trivial against that of land, with its distinct advantage of appropriation through economic rent linked to a market-based economy. Now, this was the outgrowth of what happened in the agrarian capitalism. It became linked to a market-based economy, and that's how the landlord was able to get his wealth through payments in rent. But all other monopolies are trivial in extent as compared with the monopoly of land. And the value of land expressing a monopoly pure and simple is in every respect fitted for taxation. That is to say, while the value of a railroad or telegraph line, the price of gas, or of a patent medicine may express the price of monopoly, it also expresses the exertion of labor and capital. But the value of land or economic rent, as we have seen, is in no part made up of these factors and expresses nothing but the advantages of appropriation in rent. Taxes levied upon the value of land cannot check production in the slightest degree until they exceed rent or the value of land taken annually. For unlike taxes upon commodities or exchange or capital, or any tools of process of production, they do not bear upon production. The value of land does not express the reward of production, as does the value of crops, of cattle, of building, or any of the things which are styled personal property and improvements. So the land value expresses the exchange of the value of monopoly. So it is not in any case the creation of the individual who owns the land. It is created by the growth of the community. Hence, the community can take it all without in any way lessening the incentive to improvement, or in the slightest degree lessening the production of wealth. Taxes may be imposed upon the value of land until all rent is taken by the state, without reducing the wages of labor or the rewards of capital one iota, without increasing the price of a single commodity or making production in any way more difficult. So, you see, this is why we make the case for a land value tax, because basically it's the best way to accrue, to gather revenue. We'll see that as we go on as well. Okay, so a tax on land values would end speculation. It is equivalent to a tax on speculation. You want to end speculation? Then tax speculation. That will end it. So, which is one of the great causes of dysfunctionality in economies. So taxes on the value of land not only do not check production, as do most other taxes, but they tend to increase production by destroying speculative rent. So, how speculative rent checks, let me see, originate. So, originating how speculative rent checks production may be seen not only in the valuable land withheld from use, but in the paroxysms of industrial depression, which originating in the speculative advance in land values, propagate themselves over the whole civilized world, everywhere paralyzing industry and causing more waste and probably more suffering than would a general war. Look what happened in 2008. You know, with these, all these subprime mortgages. Thank you. Basically, that was accumulation. That was wealth by accumulation. Because the money didn't exist. All that money was just lent into existence. And what happened, it was speculative. So it had such a negative effect on the whole world. Look, the whole world had a downturn. Everywhere, the GDP, everything went down 2008. Everywhere it happened. And that was the effect of that. So this is what's happening here, and what he's saying here, that this is a way to end speculation, the land value tax. So a land value tax adjusts itself to the existence of a monopoly, and that monopoly on the land has led to all growth inherent in increased values of land over time, going directly into the pockets of those in control of the land monopoly. That keeps speculative prices on land high, out of reach of most ordinary people, and it inevitably leads to a boom and bust economy. It creates the bubble. Speculation pushes more speculation, which pushes more speculation. And eventually it reaches what's called the Minsky moment, when the only way to keep this thing going is, it consumes itself. In other words, there's no longer enough money left to keep it going, and it collapses.
Kind of like the Road Runner and Coyote.
More or less. Okay, so further claims and the benefits of a single land value tax solution. So taxation taking rent for public uses would prevent all this. While if land were taxed to anything near its rental value, no one could afford to hold land that he was not using. Consequently, land not in use would be thrown open to those who would use it. Settlement would be closer, and consequently labor and capital would be enabled to produce much more with the same exertion. It is evident with regard to production, tax upon value of land is the best tax that can be imposed. The whole value of land may be taken in taxation, and the only effect will be to stimulate industry. It just works that way. Somehow when land is taxed, it doesn't keep production down. People go out there and produce more. So to open new opportunities to capital and to increase the production of wealth. Now there is no other tax you can say this about when it comes to levying taxes. Most every other thing that you levy tax upon puts the kibosh on whatever you're levying the tax upon. It's a great way to stop it. You know, Trump suddenly raises the tariffs, which is a form of taxation. So it decreases the trade. All of a sudden, nobody wants to buy it. They don't want to pay the extra tax. This is the effect that taxation has. So as to ease and cheapness of collection. So with the exception of certain licenses and stamp duties, which almost collect themselves, but it can only be relied on for trivial amounts of revenue, whereas tax upon land value can be most easily collected. Land cannot be hidden or carried off. Its value is readily ascertained, and the assessment once made, nothing but a receiver is required for collection. So under all fiscal systems, some part of the public revenues is collected from taxes on land, and the machinery for that purpose already exists and could be made to collect all as just a part of the cost of collecting all revenues now obtained by other taxes, which might be entirely saved by substituting the tax on land values for all other taxes. So there's a huge mechanism out there for collecting tax. If you just put a land value tax on, it's very simple. You only have it on land, and it's bigger revenues per person than all these little small things that you're putting taxes on, like cars. Put a tax on a car, you get more. Land is it. Land is like the biggest purchase that most people make in a lifetime. So if you're taxing that, it's a much better way to raise revenues. So overall, tax on land values is the cheapest tax with the largest revenues raised. Okay. So the savings would largely reduce the difference between what taxation now costs and what it yields. But the substitution of a tax on land values for all other taxes would operate to reduce the difference in an even more important way, and that is to reduce the price of collection. Okay, so a tax on land values does not add to prices and is paid directly by the persons on whom it falls, whereas all taxes upon things of unfixed quantities increase prices and in the course of exchange are shifted from seller to buyer, increasing as they go. So anything of unfixed quantities, and that means anything that's in production that's being used to be sold and put into the consumer market or whatever kind of market. In other words, it has checks on production. You have to check to see if you need more. If the check is on production to make it less, then you won't have more. So consumers end up paying much more than is received by the government. Taxes raise prices by increasing production costs and checking supplies. But land is outside of production, and the taxes on rent cannot check supply. Therefore, tax on rent compels landowners to pay more and in no way reduces the supply of land. A tax on land value increases competition between owners and thus reduces land prices. It gives government the largest net revenue in proportion to the amount taken from people. So as to certainty, so certainty is another important element in taxation, for just as the collection of a tax depends upon the diligence and faithfulness of the collectors and the public spirit and honesty of those who are to pay it, will opportunities for tyranny and corruption be opened on the one side and evasion and fraud on the other. So where all taxes placed upon land values irrespective of improvements, the scheme of taxation would be so simple and clear, and the public attention would be so directed to it that the valuation of taxation would and could and would be made with the same certainty that a real estate agent can determine the price of a seller that can get for a seller can get for a lot. So that's another important item of taxation, is certainty. So as to equality, so Adam Smith's canon is that the subjects ought to contribute toward the support of the government in proportion to their respective abilities, in proportion to revenue they enjoy under the protection of the state. Everyone should pay taxes in proportion to their means or in proportion to their incomes. Okay, the enjoyment of property made possible by the state is a value created and maintained by the community, which is justly called upon to meet community expenses. Now, of what value is this true? Only the value of land, the value that does not arise until the community is formed. Unlike other values, it exists only as community exists. This is not true. This is true of nothing else save of things which, like ownership of land, are in their nature monopolies. The tax upon land values is therefore the most just and equal of all taxes. It falls only upon those who receive from society a peculiar and valuable benefit, and upon them in proportion to the benefit they receive. It is the taking by the community for the use of the community of that value which is the creation of the community. It is the application of community property to common causes. When all rent is taken by taxation for the needs of community, then will the equality ordained by nature be attained. No citizen will have advantage over another, save as given by its industry, skill, and intelligence, and even will obtain what he fairly earns. And each will obtain what he fairly earns. Then, and not until then, will labor get its full reward and capital its natural return. So again, this is the proposition of doing this land value tax. And in doing this, the community benefits. And this is the same system they use in Germany. They have a public banking system that comprises up to 60 to 70% of their banking industry. And it's a circular cash flow. In other words, money is taken from the bank, it's invested into people and community. The community spends, does work, makes products, sells things. There's consumer items, there's services, people pay for it. Deposits are put back into the bank. And it's a cycle. The deposits go back into the bank. The money lent out goes back into the bank. It's increased. And then it recycles again. And there's no, in a private bank, there's a hand down the line that's always waiting to take his piece of flesh. It's always waiting. That's the shareholder value. They want to take it out. And the shareholder value, they will find anything to justify shareholder value, corporate rating, we're completely destroying something, anything that will give them shareholder value. So they can disperse it. Like they were talking one time about the commodity index fund and how they made all this extra money by running the prices up from the van shock. But they said it in cloaked terms, and it was so very clever in the interview. They said, well, yes, we were able to get some stakeholder value out of the market and put it into our shareholders' pockets, which was just to say shareholder robbing stakeholder. But, if you use those terms in capital, it's like, okay, yeah, sounds good to me, shareholder. Right? No, we want to take our shareholders good. Okay, so endorsements and ejection. Okay, so many economists and thinkers agreed land value tax is the best solution to raise tax revenue. Since the inception of Ricardo's law of rent, many reached similar conclusions on land value tax. Ricardo himself says, a tax on rent falls wholly on landlords and no other consumers, with no difference between produce from the original productive land to that from land of every other quality. So in other words, he didn't distinguish in quality. It was just a tax on the land because the land is producing. So it's producing, so he's taxing the land. So furthermore, a tax on rent would not discourage cultivation of fresh land, which pays no rent and goes untaxed. So John Stuart Mills also saw an expediency and justice to his peculiar tax or rent. So from society's general progress, so he, in other words, he was asking, what right do landlords have to accession of riches coming from society's general progress without work, risk, or economizing on their part? And although he disapproves of interfering with their claim to the present value of land, he proposes to take the whole future increase as belonging to society by natural right. So at any time this can be done with this land value tax. You can claim it as natural right. I mean, it's the community that built up all of this wealth. In other words, the land didn't come. The community came to the land and made it. Like you see certain areas in town. I mean, all these different areas that have experienced growth because they only had these places to go to. And other people kept finding the places to go to. Look at Hudson Yards. That's the largest development projects ever in the U.S. I know I've been breathing the concrete from all the building there. I live about 4 blocks away downwind from it. I tell you, I can see the difference in the dust. They're pouring a lot of concrete there. So, and of course, John Stuart Mills was an intellectual of the times and that had a lot of influence back in the 1800s. Okay, so Millicent Fawcett. The land tax is rent paid by landowners to the state in India. In India, much land is government owned. As such, land tax is rent paid direct to the state. The economic perfection of the system of tenure may be readily perceived. Again, it's a monopoly, and this time the government has it. The government is great for monopolies. Most monopolies are owned by the government and run by governments, and they have to do it. And then this, of course, is what's happening in the financialization of economies. That, they want to take those services over from the government, and which are monopolies. Jails, parking places. Goldman Sachs bought the parking places in Chicago and Midtown. They raised them all very high. Now Goldman Sachs, their people can sit in on community board, but then they can dictate policy where they don't want more parking places built than around. In other words, it's unfair advantage. It's not good capitalism. They have the monopoly, and then they will put people on the board the same way that they pay lobbyists. They will pay lobbyists to lobby against building more parking places in downtown Chicago so they can keep raising the rents. The parking meter rents, that is. Okay, so George knows that in spite of this acceptance, the principles of the rent tax were not pushed to their necessity, or their necessary conclusion, as he did in his writings, because of the indisposition to endanger or offend enormous interest in private land ownership, and from false theories of wages and profit and poverty dominating economic thought. So that's it. That's the end of my presentation.
Yeah, I was gonna turn the heat up. So, I had a question on,
Yeah.
what you
so-
were describing in the Chicago example with Goldman Sachs. That seems to be a parallel to something I was reading. I think it was book 7. But it was describing the process of Rome devolving, rotting. And they were saying that it took a while for Rome to rot, but it started in the center.
Right.
And as long as you had a healthy frontier,
Yes.
you could stave it off. So
Well,
with the Goldman Sachs
Yeah.
taking over the parking, it's like, what the hell is going on here? And it's almost like that process where it's rotting to the edges. Is that?
Well, I mean, the system, it has to rot eventually because you can't keep living off of tomorrow's wealth.
Okay, that's what it is. Yeah.
You know, look, Rome, what was the difference with Rome? I mean, Rome was the first empire that did not cancel debts. Before that, like in Babylonia, every 7 years when Hammurabi came in, I mean, they got it back then in Hammurabi. They didn't even have calculators then. All these guys, they knew it. The court mathematicians knew this. On cuneiform, whatever, then sand, whatever. They knew that there was such a thing as debt overhang. Though eventually you had to cast out the bad debt. And I mean, new kings would come and go, and I mean, then probably average lifespan for someone was in the 40s. So they had jubilee years. Every 7 years they would cancel debts. And then on the 7th cycle of the 7th year, so the 7th, the 7th time they had the 7th jubilee. So the first one would be after 7 years. The ruler comes in 7 years later, that's the first jubilee. So on the 7th jubilee, the 49 years, all land went back to the original owner, all debts were canceled. Now Rome decided not to cancel the debts. And that's one of the things that did it to them. But you can't do that. You have to cancel, get rid of those bad debts, move on, make more new money. Like, in other words, you'll make more money. Like, first of all, when the banks do that, when they loan someone money, that loan doesn't come back for 2 years, 2 or 3 year loan, whatever. They sell the loan at the beginning and they make money on it that way. And they can just do that all day long.
Well, the reason you cannot cancel any debt right now is because the debts are privatized. Most of the debts are privatized by the institution. So.
Well, the debt is being used to finance everything. Yeah.
Think about Greece, right? 2010 Greece. The Greece debt crisis. So Greece they borrowed a lot of debts for dominate in Europe. So if the creditors decide not to forgive their debts, they have no way to cancel their own debts by their own government, because all these loans were provided by mostly like German banks, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, the same thing like
you're talking about a situation which was possible, which was very, very hard for the Greece government to. I mean, they can restructure their debts, right?
Mm-hmm.
They can restructure their. That's the possible way, but there's no way they can pay off that debt, and there's no way they can cancel their debt because their debt was not controlled by the Greek government.
Well, you know what basically.
They're like right now, the United States, we have how much? $22 trillion debt, right? Treasury debts. Half of them are owned by foreign entities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not in United States government's control to cancel their own debt, even though they desperately want to do that. lot of similar situations are, you know, a lot of similar situations can be found in many cases, which the entity, the debt is very different from like Asian debt. Basically, the Asian debt.
Well, I mean, the point.
It's very
Yeah.
because you only have, you know, someone, a king or divine entity or a palace. Most of the time, they are palaces. The debts are paid by the capital to the palace. So it's very easy for them, even though like Roman Empire, like I said.
Yeah, but
Sorry,
the point is on this, excuse me, let me interrupt. The point is that, you know, they don't want to redo the debt. So, I mean, like you saw it with student loans. You can't get out of a student loan. They've got you for life. That's like a form of slavery. You know? I mean, and of course, you know, most students would get out of it in some way if they could. But you know, they've done it so that they don't want to cancel debts anymore. I mean, anyone, you know, it will not win you friends. If you're a banker, if you're a high-level banker, and you opt to cancel debts and do things, it will not win you friends. Because I mean, there was a banker, a German banker, you know, when, you know, what England and the U.S. wanted, they didn't want Germany to reunify all at once. You know, do it quickly. They did it within a year, right? You know, the wall went down, and within 6 months they were unified.
Well, they bought it. I mean, they paid. West Germany paid. They paid.
Yes, but the point is that.
The German unification.
Let me finish my point, okay? Please. Yeah, let me finish my point. Okay.
The unification, the reunification of Germany is very different because the Western Germany, they.
Sai, we're going off topic, okay? So my point was about debt cancellation, okay? So the reason is they had a banker, Herrenhauser, this guy, and he wanted to cancel all the debt with the East Bloc countries. You know, and let them start off new again, now that the wall fell and everything, you know, give these guys a, you know, they're gonna come into the family of capitalism, let them start off
Like a
clean.
jubilee, I guess. Like a jubilee, like what you.
More or less, yeah, like a jubilee, like the same concept. But what happened is, well, he didn't live very long. You know, I mean, the people that got this guy knew what they were doing pretty good, because he had a lead car and another car, and he was in the middle, and they had to stop the eye. And what they got him, he had like plated doors, but they got him. He bled to death because the shrapnel came up through the bottom. So in other words, he was basically assassinated. So you know, being a banker, a high-level banker, and wanting to forgive debt will not win you friends.
Well, that was good. This was book 8. We're doing the Progress and Poverty a little bit out of order. I'm going to do book 6 and 7, but when they get posted on the website, you won't really know because they're going to be in order. So look for that in 2 weeks. I'm going to be teaching my last Land Value Capture course tomorrow. Should be kind of exciting. Diana, if you, I had a student in my Land Value class, Land Value Capture class, who knew how to identify the property values and how much they're paying in taxes, you know, to kind of verify some of the things that Mike was talking about. It was interesting because I had the same concept that the building on the northeast corner of 3rd Avenue and East 38 was just sitting there vacant, and I was thinking, well, they're probably not paying anything. But it turns out that they're paying $250,000 a year in taxes just to be positioned so that in the future, then the development goes up. So somebody is paying this money because the payoff in 5 or 10 or whatever years is so valuable, and if they didn't pay it, somebody else would come along and do the same thing. So anyway, so he wrote a little paper on how to do what he did. So I mentioned this in a class, and I said, somebody should take a project and figure out how to do that. And he did it, and then like 5 minutes later, he said, I got the answer. And it was like, so I told him, well, you should do the rest of the city, now that that was so fast, you know. But if you come tomorrow, maybe I'll show how that was done.
Okay, thanks for coming.
Yeah, so what did you think about the class? This, you didn't know what to expect.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, this,
it's
see,
very
we just,
interesting.
in other words, nobody reads Henry George, so we do this class where we read it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
No,
that's,
and to be honest, like, I don't do a lot of reading around.
So you liked it?
I don't do a lot of reading around these topics. I was just curious. I was looking for like different events to sign up for, and like this was one of them. And I found it very interesting.
Oh, good.
Like, I
Hope you come back.
just to learn a little bit about different things. Thank you so much.
Some other classes usually have more people. Some other classes usually have more people and more discussion. This time it was,
This class is,
This is really,
they set up
yeah,
very,
that was the reason.
yeah.
in shorter notice.
Yeah, we do
okay,
have a
thank you,
restroom.
thank you very
Thank you
much
so
for
much.
coming.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
We do have a restroom if you need it.
Oh,
We have a restroom.
oh, yeah, oh, no, I was gonna say.
Okay,
thank you so
good
much.
to see you.
Again, I don't know if I'll come tomorrow because I have a really busy week.
You know, I have to stop using this,
Yeah,
see how
check-
all the
yeah,
words
sure.
get
Just
skewed.
check the website.
When I
You can see
transfer-
old
I like
videos, like
Yeah.
smart talks. You saw the website?
I saw, well, I saw the event, Brian.
No, I mean, what happened is, when I
You go to
transferred from my computer from the thumb drive,
Yeah.
it
You'll
it
see
scrambles
old,
up
Like the
some of
ones
the
that you have
titles,
here.
you know, I mean, I did this other
Yeah.
class.
Yeah, there's some that I
like,
did, and
Capitalism,
then there's a,
and I look, I
there's a
couldn't
feature
believe it, I
called,
couldn't
What Would
recognize
Henry
the
George
slide.
Say?
And I
So
just,
I-
I've lived it.
I gave him one from
Nobody that
today,
came
like
use it
Paul
didn't really
Krugman
matter.
was talking
It was
about,
readable,
well, it's
right?
not that bad.
What's
to
that?
have
It was
that.
readable, by the way.
So I keep on
So I
bringing up the
wanted
point
to ask,
that if you
will
capture
you
land
repeat
value, it's the opposite
capitalism
of
in
debt.
Germany at some point?
Because you're
I
capturing
hope
something
so, I
that's
actually like
ours.
it. You,
I,
were you there?
let it go.
unfortunately, I.
So look
Oh.
for that.
Oh,
I
yeah.
had
I
some,
was fully.
Well,
I had
did,
a, like
did
a
I send you,
5-week
you were
course
from us,
called
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Georgia's
The-
Check,
Ecology,
Exactly.
because
I don't know, it's on my email.
one of the few people in
I
the
remember.
movement that has a
So, yeah, well, you know, look, so I sent you
There's
the
way of
the
looking at,
middle
you
stock,
familiar
all
with
that
Eleanor
shit.
Ostrom?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know when the
Resource
learning
management
review
system.
is supposed to teach it.
Well, she had this
So,
idea
maybe this
that
spring or so, I don't
there's
know. But yeah, you know, I like it.
there's commonly owned
you come?
resources that people would just,
In Germany?
it's like natural law, they really learn to share it.
I could not.
There was a lot of
Switzerland,
positive feedback from
there's
people.
pasture land that's
There was a
been run
community
as
in
a
Germany,
common
they used
property
their own
for
currency.
thousands of years. And, so anyway, so if you think about
Yeah.
land value as being a thing that's commonly owned,
Yeah.
then the rules for how
A lot of
to
them have
manage
Switzerland.
commonly owned things are already set.
Yeah, they
It's
do.
just a matter of agreeing to it.
No, they, I'm telling you, they do. I'm just listen-
So your background is what?
I know,
It's not
like,
Europe, no, there's
Software.
another
Yeah.
in Germany.
they have like a complementary
Two
currency.
people in the,
It's not,
like
yeah,
our class.
it's not
Like a
complementary.
regional
Yeah,
currency.
regional currency.
Yeah, then,
Yeah, so you,
I forget, it's
you're
in Switzerland.
you're in a good thing
Helen-
for, you know,
Okay, it's
people
in
like to
Germany.
think.
No, I know
and
one in
collaborate.
Switzerland, but I don't know one in Germany, I know one in Switzerland.
Thank you so
Because
much.
I was,
Good seeing you.
thinking
Yeah.
about, I went to the country's conference. And,
Bye.
This lady, she was from Germany. I think she was from France.
I forgot the name of it, but you know, I wanted to ask you also, real check.
Yeah.
So a thaler, T-H-A-L-E-R.
Yeah.
They used to come from there used to be a big silver mine in Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, it's called Yakimo.
Yeah, exactly, so in the Middle Ages, they used to make coins from there, right? So what country, I mean, who was using the thaler? Was it Prussia, or was it like a pan-European coin for trade, or what?
Well, I'm definitely not sure. I know that the city is now in our country, Czech Republic,
Mm-hmm.
and as far as I know, the tailor gave him the dollar. That's all I know about it. I don't know if it was really that much used.
No, the reason I'm asking, because in other words, it has to do with, in 1818, when the Swedish army came with the Dutch, and they went through Westphalia, they paid a reparation fee to Westphalia province for marching through their territory of 160,000 people.
I think it's good.
Okay, I don't know about it. I'm not as well versed in history.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, no, so I just read it, but no, it's just been just, this is just my intellectual work. It's just like, most people think that someone's smart if they say a bunch of things, but that's just what they do. It's like, would you like, my intellectual puke, or
Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't view that.
Critiquing
Right. No, yeah, but I was just curious, because I know, I read it, I looked it up, I read it, these days, we have the Library of Alexander in our hand, we can find anything practically. It's like, interesting, can like keep you spending hours. I do it now, I spend too much time on this.
Unfortunately, with all this material, I'm working with in data world, basically here on Wall Street.
You're working with
Data processing.
Oh, you're in the data business.
Yeah. And one of the biggest problem is that you have too much data, but not enough information. Everybody's obsessing about data. So
If your
for example,
presentation comes
Well, I need to clean my
good
computer
enough, we
out.
could,
Yeah, in other words, that's how it is with everyone. In other words, what it is, I thought of it the other day, I thought, I've got my refrigerator capitalist. A refrigerator capitalist.
What does it mean?
So capitalism, the goal is accumulation. Right. So you see some people, when you open their fridge, it's always full.
Right.
No, they're hoarded, accumulation. They're hoarded. So I call them.
going back.
Or, and not some people, they just only have enough to eat. Like in most of Europe you go, people do that. They will shop just for the meal. That's it. I don't
Good job,
do
Mike.
that too much, but.
Yeah, it's you.
Okay, yes, thank you, Marty.
Tomorrow.
Okay, thanks, Don. Thanks for coming. Yeah, sorry to cut you off about that, but it wasn't about unification. It was about,
They paid the way.
I know the story. I used to live there. I know the whole story.
No, I'm just telling you, it's different. It's very different because
Yeah,
in West
no,
Germany,
but
they agreed to pay for the.
But the point that I was making was the banker, they killed him.
We got a sign-in sheet.
See you sometime.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm gonna call you back in a bit, okay? I just finished up on the talk, okay? Oh, Anna, let me call you back. I'm just, about like 10 minutes, okay? Bye-bye. Yeah. All right, well, thanks for coming.
Definitely. When you get discussion about
Why did that-
it always gets passionate about that topic with everybody. Yeah.
It's like it always turns into a rambling monologue.
Yeah. That happened many times.
Yeah.
But since it's your German, I think we want to give more discussions on that topic.
To the reunification.
Well, all that.
Did you stop it?
Yeah. No, it's still running. It's still running the video.
Oh, Ibrahima.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We finished a little early too.
Yeah, Ibrahima, I'm gonna buy a set. You know what it is? You're right.